The COVID-19 pandemic has stopped tourism in its tracks all over the world, and many destinations are rethinking the future of their tourism industries. And that includes New Zealand, the South Pacific destination, which built a highly successful tourism industry off the back of sharing its natural wonders. Indeed, the country branded itself over the last 20 years or so as 100% pure. So perhaps an aspirational goal, but a slogan that has come under increasing scrutiny over the last decade or so from both locals and visitors as to what it means and how genuinely committed is the tourism industry in New Zealand to sustainability. So there have been efforts prior to this current pandemic. Indeed, our 2005 tourism strategy, and Bruce, who I'll introduce in a moment, was closely involved in that, included sustainability as a key element. But certainly the pandemic has redoubled the country's efforts to rethink how tourism can be built back better. So we're going to be sharing lessons and takeaways and trying throughout this to make it practical and applicable to you, your destination, wherever you are in the world, whether it's across the Western United States, Western Canada, or you're a supplier or partner of Go West in other countries. So I'm delighted to be joined by a very good friend and an old colleague and one of the sort of foremost thinkers and connectors of tourism in New Zealand, Bruce Bassett, who's Manager of Strategy at the Tourism Industry Association of Aotearoa. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Chris, and kia ora, everybody from New Zealand. I'm down in Wellington, New Zealand at the moment, and it's a real pleasure to link in with you guys in North America. Yeah, really interesting times for tourism, and we'll, as we progress through the presentation, we'll come across a whole lot of different ways that we're thinking about the industry now and how we can make it, as Chris used the words, build back better.
Very good. So, and these themes, I think, and challenges, questions are universal. So we're going to go through today in 5 parts. We'll be talking about the process that's being undertaken in terms of how tourism's being reimagined. We're going to address that in 5 sort of thematic areas or pillars for that reimagination. Throughout, we're going to try and provide some practical examples in each of those sort of 5 thematic areas of what does this mean in New Zealand, and what are some of the opportunities in any destination, wherever you might be. We're going to have a quick discussion at the end, time permitting. We will ask a poll question for your feedback and to try and understand how you're thinking about some of these issues, and then hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. Now, the slides from today are all available, along with resources and links to the range of reports and research and resources we're going to address today. All are already up and available at that web address you can see up on your screen above the dramatic skyline of Queenstown, New Zealand. One of the areas actually that was undergoing tremendous pressures from growth prior to the pandemic, and one of the regions of New Zealand that has been particularly hard hit by the closure of borders. We're fortunately in New Zealand have grappled with COVID-19 very successfully, so we've got a pretty thriving domestic tourism industry, but certainly in parts of New Zealand like Queenstown, that hasn't made up for the loss of international visitors. So I'll come back to that web address at the end. Obviously, the pandemic is just one of a number of sort of bigger themes and threats and challenges facing not just tourism, but the economy and society in general. And many of those have been amplified just even in the last sort of week or so. If you think about what's happened in Texas with the dramatic winter storms, of course, what happened throughout the American West with fires, etc., our neighbours across the Tasman and Australia. So these are very big picture issues. And Bruce, from TIA's perspective, the tourism industry, how have you been sort of thinking about and responding to some of these very big, challenging, complex issues?
Yeah, the tourism industry, Aotearoa, the organisation I work through, which is the industry association, we very much sought to take a long-term view of the industry. We have a tourism industry strategic framework called Tourism 2025 and Beyond, and that integrates the ethos of sustainability into the heart of the industry strategy. So sustainability for us is about taking a long view, increasingly a multi-generational view about the resources and people that we use in tourism to make sure that we leave it better than we get it, and sort of very much we use the term sustainability, but increasingly it's getting into the notion of regenerative, so that's getting sort of hardwired, if you like, into the DNA of the industry from the TIA perspective. So we've got to work really hard to make sure that embeds at the commercial level within businesses who are actually operating the industry. COVID has brought a lot of the longer term thinking to a very sharp juncture, shall we say. New Zealand has around 3 million inbound visitors a year. We are a 3-hour flight from our nearest neighbours, Australia. So we're an island in the South Pacific that's pretty isolated. So with the onset of COVID and the closing of borders, our international visitor industry essentially stopped dead. And after 50 or 60 years of growing constantly, or to 4, 5, 6%, sometimes more cumulatively, the industry was facing the challenge of increasing demand, maybe a little bit beyond capacity. We'll talk about that a little later. But COVID has stopped it dead in the water, which has meant that we've had to look to our domestic tourism market to sustain tourism businesses. There's been quite a strong government response to support tourism businesses also. And so now we're looking at, well, how is the COVID period going to end? And how we're going to come through that with completely closed borders, except for bringing a few people in, repatriating New Zealanders and the like. We're going to be starting from a clean sheet of paper, so we're very interested in what that is going to look like. And so that creates an opportunity to sort of look beyond the recovery phase, which has got a whole lot of factors in it that tourism industry can't control at all, like how effectively the vaccines work, and how does transmission work with vaccines, and all those sort of things. So it's been really important to look beyond the COVID period to say, well, what is the ideal time? What does the ideal New Zealand tourism industry look like? How can we put in place the levers and the policies to make sure we get there, and how do we right size it for what New Zealand wants? So it's enabled us to have a look at the longer term. So when we come through recovery, we will have thought through a lot of the things will enable us to recover in a better state than we went into the COVID period. So it's working in the industry for quite a while. This COVID period has just shaken the industry severely, and it will have to reset in a slightly different sort of way. We don't know the shape of the recovery, but we also know there are bigger things like climate change coming along that we really, really have to be thinking about now in order to if we can, work towards mitigation of those, the downsides of climate change that are clearly coming, but there's still time for us to do things about if we act pretty quickly. So
yes, and
a lot there.
Yeah, and we'll be addressing some of these longer term challenges like climate change with that second big blue wave you see on the graphic here, the recession. The economic impact's going to be pretty pronounced. And so we're going to need to do things in a smart, thoughtful, and resource savvy way, every destination in the world. So tourism in New Zealand's being reimagined by a number of entities and by a number of organisations. We're going to sort of coalesce the thinking of each of these entities and the 5 themes, but we'll just briefly introduce the 3 entities that are sort of rethinking either tourism specifically, or in some cases, such as the Climate Change Commission, or we have with the New Zealand Parliament a dedicated office and a commissioner for the environment who is focused obviously on all matters sustainability. And then obviously there's changing traveller expectations and values. So not just the entities within New Zealand, but frankly, our consumers, our travellers, whether they be local or international, have new expectations, new demands on how destinations need to grapple with some of these issues. So, Bruce, do you want to briefly just introduce the work of the Tourism Futures Task Force, which is sort of in some ways at the centre of reimagining the future of tourism in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure, Chris. Yeah, the Tourism Futures Task Force was appointed by the Minister of Tourism, towards the middle of last year, and it was very specifically designed to step beyond the COVID period and the recovery period to what a more ideal tourism system would look like for Aotearoa New Zealand. So it's very much a system level. It's thinking about what are the systemic problems or characteristics of the tourism industry we want to move away from. So how do we design or reimagine an industry that works better overall? Just for a bit of context, tourism is about directly around 6% of New Zealand's GDP, around about 10% of the workforce, and 21% of our export earnings. So it's a really important part of the New Zealand economy. So it's important we get it right, but it's really, really important we get it right for the people of New Zealand as well. Visitors go into their communities, their backyards, and that's got to be a really, really good relationship.
And there's a number of steps they're going through, aren't they? And so where are they at in the process right now?
Yeah, they've been running now for around 6 months. It's got this task force has been set up by government. It's got a co-chairs. One of them is a leading tourism industry chief executive, Grant Webster, and the other co-chair is a mayor of Rotorua, who used to be also a cabinet minister. So they've got nice leadership. They've got a really diverse bunch of around 10 people on the group, and they've been working with support of senior officials in Tourism New Zealand, our economic development agency, and Department of Conservation. So they've got quite a process. They've got an advisory group that is around 30 people from the industry that they've been using to really, really test out thinking and ideas and to workshop a whole range of things. So the breadth of information going into the process is pretty good. So the state we're at now, there's a draft report has gone to the Minister of Tourism for consideration, and we're waiting for feedback from that pretty shortly. Certainly the co-chairs briefed the industry on the key elements of the work they're doing, and that's what we will talk about today. So we've got draft material, not final material. That'll be a couple of months away before we get that. So there is, but it really signals a pretty important shift on how we think about the industry in New Zealand. So that's why it's really interesting, I think, to convey this line of thinking to you guys, so that just you some awareness of maybe an interesting way of thinking about the future in tourism.
And I think some of the key lessons from the setup of the Tourism Futures Task Force is the importance of getting public and private sectors involved. So whichever destination you are, that the tourism industry needs to engage with its public sector partners to ensure they're at the table as part of this process, and vice versa, frankly, that where the public sector might be leading it, that the tourism industry has a really strong voice on some of the business and practical realities of the recommendations. Now, the task force is undertaking work in conjunction with some of the bigger picture entities I talked about that look well beyond just tourism into overall sustainability and environmental issues. One is the Climate Change Commission, Bruce.
Yeah, this is a major bit of work. New Zealand is taking pretty solid steps towards organising itself so we can have a very clear pathway towards a zero emission economy by 2050, and preferably sooner than that. So the Climate Change Commission is an independent body of government that is reported it's got a draft report out at the moment, which actually sets out the steps needed to be taken to achieve the zero emissions. Some interesting findings in there that with current technologies and policies as they are set, we won't get there. But if we change the known policies and technologies, we can get there. So it's very much about changing the settings, and it doesn't take into account new technologies that are going to come along down the path, and so that's my read of this big report is that it's actually it sets out a reasonable pathway. There are going to be 3 initial budgets set for 3 or 4 year periods for the next decade. And that really is, and with the policies to get there, so that really gives us some shorter term targets. So this report is out for consultation at the moment and is due to be reported back to government by the middle of this year. And the expectation is then that the government will really put in place the new policies and that need to drive the changes. Electrification of the vehicle fleet, being an important one, but also, in New Zealand we've got a lot of livestock, so methane emissions from our dairy herd is actually a really major issue and quite a unique one for New Zealand in relation to the size of our economy in terms of those emissions. So there's a whole lot of really great things that have been highlighted in the report that are going to force us to think about the future. From a tourism industry perspective, we'll be submitting on this. We've had a good look at it. International aviation isn't included in it because it wasn't part of the Paris Agreement, and that goes for cruise shipping also. So it's very much, we're looking at a domestic picture. So domestic aviation is included, and certainly key aspects of that need to move. The report isn't super keen on offsetting. It's in New Zealand we can basically offset by planting plantation pine trees that get harvested, or native forest. And New Zealand is heavily forested. It certainly was originally. So a lot of moves to regenerate the native forest that can be a permanent carbon sink. So there are a lot of elements in this report. But what's really exciting what's really important is that it's coming out at a time that sits with other key strategic documents. So really looking at it as a time where we're going to get some changes in the way we do things with climate, but with other things also.
Yeah, and in the United States, obviously, with a new administration, there's going to be a much more assertive action. And that you can see that evidence already from the announcement over the last several months from major auto manufacturers such as GM, announcing they're pretty much going to electrify their entire vehicle fleet by 2035, as well as Bill Gates' book that's just come out in the last week or so, which looks at some really important issues, some of the areas that often aren't discussed that well, such as what do we do with construction and concrete and steel and, some of the less sort of well understood areas about the dramatic changes we're going to have to see there. And then just finally, the other entity we just wanted to touch on is the dedicated entity set up by Parliament in New Zealand to focus on sustainability. This entity has a very wide brief. Just prior to the pandemic, a major report came out called Pristine, Popular, Imperiled, ? Which really spoke to some of the growth pressures that tourism was putting on New Zealand. And so what's your comments about the Commissioner for the Environment and their work, Bruce?
This is a really interesting piece of work. I'm not sure whether you have these sort of offices in the States and in Canada. This is a body set up by our Parliament, our House of Representatives, to report to the Parliament. It's not to ministers, it's not to the government of the day. So it's really set up to be independent and say things as it sees fit. As Chris pointed out with this report, it looked at tourism as a whole and, drew a conclusion. There are a bunch of things that needed to be addressed, quite a few things. So it became a really good information resource for our whole, for us here at TIA to look at, how we think about the industry and, where is it social and environmental sort of pressure points. It issued, the Commissioner issued a new report a couple of weeks ago that honed in on four key issues. And so you know, these are going to be really interesting. Interesting that they nailed it down to 4, because there are quite a few more they could have looked at. But when we were briefed by the commissioner, sort of addressing tourism-related aviation emissions is clearly the major sort of issue from an environmental perspective for New Zealand. We're about as distant from anywhere as you can get. So we're basically long haul to just about every country except Australia. So we're vulnerable to aviation and consumer resistance to long haul flying and all those things that are coming on. We're certainly coming along pre-COVID. So it's great to have a suggestion here. The recommendation from the Commissioner is to establish a departure tax, which will generate quite a bit of money that he says should be essentially most of it put into New Zealand joining all sorts of research collaborations around the world to actually look at the technologies and how aviation can change and be ultimately carbon zero. So interesting line of thought. You know, as I say, this is an independent body. It's not a government policy. but it will be food for thought for government.
Okay. Just conscious we should keep moving here, Bruce, in the interest of time. So let's move on to the 5 sort of themes we're going to talk about that coalesces each of the work of these entities. So we're going to address these themes, provide some practical examples, and try and make them applicable and practical to your destination or wherever you are in the world. So the first is a sort of esoteric concept of identity and purpose. So we talked about how Aotearoa is the Māori name for New Zealand. What does Aotearoa Whakapapa mean, and what is this theme about?
This essentially means Aotearoa New Zealand. Whakapapa is a Māori word for lineage or generations building on top of each other. So it becomes a very long-term view of where people came from and therefore where people are going for the future generations. So it's as you say, it's deeply rooted in values about expressing who we are as New Zealanders and how we want to operate a tourism industry so that we can present our hospitality and places to our visitors. We're seeing here is what's called a hongi. This is a touch of the nose and the forehead with the person you're greeting, and it's a sharing of breath. So when you do a hongi in New Zealand, you're actually becoming bound to that person. And it's a way of connecting, and it's it's a really affirming part of the New Zealand Maori culture.
And I think a key theme from this, which is universal, is the concept of authenticity, that rooting any sort of reflection of change in a really deep understanding of who you are as a community, as a destination, what is unique and special about you, what are the values you hold, and ensuring that you, not only understand that, but you engage with the local community, and whatever change, you bring them along so that tourism reflects their values and that they feel comfortable with however tourism is built back.
Yep, well said, Chris.
So let's move on to the second sort of big theme, which is about stewardship. And there's a Māori word called kaitiakitanga, which means stewardship or guardianship or looking after the natural environment. And so how would you introduce this theme, Bruce?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much along the lines of guardianship. It's making sure we look after our place. So we've got the words demonstrating our care for te taio and each other. So te taio is essentially nature. So it's putting people in with nature. So we're actually caring for our place, and that being the essential element. So tiaki is care. And so we have a program in New Zealand where we connect with visitors and essentially, how can letting people know how they can be great visitors in New Zealand. How can they care for the land? How can they travel safely? How can they respect culture? And how to care for New Zealand generally. So it's a really nice piece of mirroring, Maori values and putting in a form that our visitors can relate to and say, hey, well, because there's nothing better than if you're a visitor. You actually feel you have permission to be there and you're welcome and you understand how, that you're fitting in nicely with the community and not doing harm and, actually making things better. So it's very much a permissioning thing for visitors, but also for New Zealand, it's a way of telling our story about what's important for us. So Te Aki has been very well supported by industry. It came about as an industry government coalition, collaborative work. So it's been a very, very solid base.
So this concept of visitor care codes will be familiar to many of you. There's been many examples around the world. Palau, for example, in the Pacific, had a sort of visitor care code expressed as a sort of passport. There's also entities such as the Travel Care Code that I've been involved in for some time. That's a not-for-profit that highlights these sorts of messaging around responsibility. And the state of Colorado has done a lot of extraordinary work in terms of helping educate visitors through their work with Leave No Trace. So moving along in terms of this broad area of guardianship, another key thing we could emphasize is what's happening with aviation. There's actually a great video that The Economist magazine put out just in the last couple of weeks that really details some of the big picture technology challenges we're going to need to address to get aviation. It was transformational, of course. Long-haul aviation was transformational. The year I was born, back in the 60s, we had 27,000 visitors to New Zealand. As Bruce mentioned, well in excess of 3 million, approaching 4 million visitors came in 2019. So obviously it enabled all sorts of connections and tourism industry growth, but we now have a challenge to ensure that that footprint is going to become much more sustainable over time. And there is going to be increasing pressures. I think the next round of climate negotiations is definitely going to include probably more aggressive actions in the aviation space. And we could liken that in New Zealand, the sort of technology breakthrough we're going to need, whether it's biofuels, whether it's electric aircraft, looking at things like hydrogen fuel, is the sort of big picture breakthroughs in technology we've seen before. And actually Bill Gates' book talks about this, that we're going to need new technologies that haven't been invented yet. But New Zealand back in the 1800s was completely transformed by a new technology called refrigeration. Prior to that, we couldn't get our produce to distant markets, particularly the UK. But in the 1880s, refrigeration completely transformed the ability of New Zealand to make a living in the world by enabling that produce to be shipped anywhere. So we're going to need a similar sort of breakthrough, and frankly, New Zealand and other destinations reliant on aviation should and can be directly involved in this. It's going to take money. And so tourism taxation and funding is one of the big picture issues here. Miles Partnership, along with a range of other partners, were involved in a big set of reports, all under the umbrella of Funding for Tomorrow. These reports and research was done pro bono for the industry. It's freely available. There was a big report on North America about all the options and opportunities for tourism funding and taxation, and one in Europe. And that's picking up concepts such as visitor levies. New Zealand's had a visitor levy for the last couple of years on all international arrivals. Some of the reports we've talked about, such as the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment, talk about expanding the number and significance of these levies. And it also includes levies such as on rental vehicles that could potentially fund electric e-byways, such as this example here in Oregon. And I believe some of the funding for the electric or scenic electric byways in Oregon with charging stations, etc., have been funded from their tourism hotel tax at a state level. So that's that second area of guardianship and stewardship. We need to have that focus. We need to target those sort of technology breakthroughs, and that, along with a range of other areas, is going to require a rethink about our funding, not least because, of course, a lot of businesses and destination organizations of all types have been hugely and massively hit by the pandemic, and they need funding support as well. Okay, moving along to the third theme. Do you want to introduce this area, Bruce, and what's a practical example of this in action?
Yeah, this is very much around, ensuring the success, if you like, of the tourism industry from a financial and integration with society's perspective. Thrive is the really key word there, and the notion that the industry does its stuff and everybody thrives, whether it's the commercial, the businesses, whether it's communities, whether it's individual people and jobs, and so it's making sure that it's this theme is about making sure the industry is successful for people in whatever endeavours they're doing in relation to the industry.
And there's a key time right now, isn't there, Bruce, with the recovery? So there's been a number of important ways in which the government in New Zealand have helped the tourism industry. Some critics would say perhaps not enough or not timely enough, but there has been a range of efforts. There'll be more efforts in the upcoming budget. And in the States, of course, the recovery package, the $1.9 trillion package that is in front of Congress, is also a really important piece of helping tourism industry. There's actually some great research being done by the OECD that summarizes the sort of government support and recovery across the world. And so there's all sorts of examples and another area in which we can learn from each other. So one program that's been in place for some time and is going to be an important part of this sort of Thrive is the Mood of the Nation. Do you want to introduce this, Bruce?
Yeah, around 5 years ago, we recognised that tourism was, there's a bit of community pushback, I think, from around tourism in certain places at certain times of the year. So ourselves and our national marketing body, Tourism New Zealand, have been running what we call the Mood of the Nation. And that is essentially to ask residents how they're really feeling about tourism. And there's quite a few indicators in this, but I think this line graph sort of indicates that the perception that that tourism is putting too much pressure on New Zealand. And there's quite a gradual increase in that sense that visitors are putting too much pressure on New Zealand. So we've been really mindful of that in terms of, we recognise the importance of what we, social licence as an important, New Zealanders need to welcome and be friendly to visitors, and so it needs to work well. So this line is a bit of an alert to us. It's one of the things that are feeding into the work of the Futures Task Force. So how can we, when we reset the industry, reimagine it when tourism comes back? We're actually starting from a much lower level with this sort of indicator. And so it's great having tracking metrics like this because there's often a lot of anecdotal information, but to have a nice, stable, steady line like this saying that, actually increasing visitation is associated with increasing resistance from New Zealanders about that. That's something we've got to be really mindful of. In many respects, it's the key KPI for the industry.
Yes, and it really taps or builds on the first theme, authenticity, connecting with your local community, understanding their values and perspective. And this sort of resident sentiment research has been done again in many destinations. A range of countries have formalised research in place. A number of destinations in the American West have. So putting these sorts of mechanisms in place to understand what do locals think about tourism is a critical component, I think, of building back better, because it allows you to stay in touch with the views of arguably your most important audience, which is locals. Do they support tourism? Do they support reopening your community to tourism? And that's going to be a big challenge in the United States and other countries as we get beyond the immediate sort of peak of the pandemic. Currently, there's a lot of concern in some communities about reopening, so we need to bring them along. And then obviously as we grow back to ensure that they feel comfortable. So we're on the final straight here.
So this one is essentially about the destination and making sure that we're managing the place well, whether it's very local places or whether it's the national system. So it's being very informed and having structures and ways to, to manage places, bringing in the community and the industry and all other stakeholders in New Zealand, Maori communities. It's really, really important that they're on board and engaged and actually able and actually getting opportunities and benefit from the industry. So yeah, fundamental is how we look after the system locally, nationally, regionally.
So the destination management guidelines that are shown here, Bruce, there's been quite a lot of work, hasn't there, with destination management plans, strategies and investments in regions of New Zealand.
Yeah, very much so. Up until not too long ago, destination tourism plans were basically marketing exercises. The current government has made a real purposeful step to say, hey, no, we need a more holistic way of managing destinations. So the government has developed these destination management guidelines and has provided funding and is working with industries to regions to actually local government, and we've got quite a few quite small local government jurisdictions in New Zealand, but to be taking on these guidelines and actually proactively thinking about tourism from a holistic perspective. TIA, the interest of my program running our sustainability effort is to make sure we've got sustainability embedded within each of those destination management plans, so that it's a longer term, it's has a holistic lens on where they want to be going. Really key for investment in infrastructure and building for the longer term. So we're very supportive of this destination management approach.
So in your destination, wherever you might be across the West or internationally, ensuring that your destination has a destination management plan, that it's both, it's got buy-in from both public sector and private sector, and it's got investment behind it is going to be key. And so then we go back to the issue of funding. So New Zealand's grappling with this. How do you fund destination management, the sort of research, the sort of strategy and oversight, the infrastructure that is needed to sort of ensure that you manage tourism growth requires money. And so New Zealand's also reviewing, what are the ways in which we collect revenue from visitors and how do we remit that? And there's lots of examples across the world of mechanisms like tourism improvement districts. And increasingly, those tourism improvement districts are focused around these issues of destination management. So one example is Portland, Oregon, which many of you will understand and know that, a city in the US that really has had a big commitment to sustainability for some period of time. And their recent, I think it's 2 or 3 years old now, their tourism improvement district that added to an existing sort of hotel tax, where most of that money from the hotel tax was going into either the general coffers of the state or city government, not specifically to tourism or tourism management. They were able to use significant parts of this TID revenue towards destination management, whether it be research, whether it be destination management grants, or helping local and visitor events such as their dining week. And just a final comment on this, the understanding the full costs and benefits of tourism as a whole, internationally, our industry needs to do a lot more work to understand the full costs and benefits of tourism, including all the taxes and fees paid by visitors. And they can be numerous, as we know in the United States. If you pick up a rental car or check into a hotel, the list of various taxes and fees can be already very extensive. Really understanding all of that money that's collected, the economic benefits, the social benefits and so forth, but also the true full costs of tourism as an industry. I think we've got to do a lot more work in this space. And this report here, which was put out by Cornell and a number of other NGO partners, really is sort of perhaps looking very much at the cost side of the equation, but is a partial contribution to this fuller understanding we're all going to need. And then the final theme, Bruce, is this very practical one about using data, technology, and research. And just before I ask you to comment on this, one area that has been transformational and really enables us to connect with you today, hopefully in a pretty seamless experience, is the ultra-fast broadband initiative. So that benefited tourism enormously. So this was a public-private sector initiative by the New Zealand government, but with big communication companies involved starting about a decade ago. And the ultra-fast broadband initiative in New Zealand rolled out fibre and other sort of connectivity solutions across New Zealand, including into rural and remote regions. It's still ongoing. There's still a few pockets, but this was enormously important to dealing with this pandemic and arguably one of the most successful infrastructure investments ever in the history of New Zealand. So we might be one of the most remote countries, but fortunately, New Zealand now has got a pretty modern, sophisticated, high-speed connection to the rest of the world that enables us to connect and share just like we are today. And that is a big issue across the American West, where some rural communities still do not have strong connectivity. And it's fundamental to also enabling digital training and education, where quite a lot of work's going on in New Zealand now through initiatives such as Digital Boost to lift the digital skills and capacity and capability of businesses, which is also part of building back better, ensuring that we have a more sophisticated, capable tourism industry and workforce that can use digital platforms in a targeted, productive way. So do you just want to comment on this final area, Bruce, in terms of what does this mean for the future of research, both in a New Zealand context and then perhaps internationally?
Yeah, firstly, the key word in that is enabling. So whatever you need to have to enable you to make great decisions and to shape and guide the industry, this theme is about putting those in place. So we, from that perspective, good data, research, industry research, academic research, asking the really hard questions, I think is going to be key. So we've got quite a bit of movement to make there. So we're going to be very, very interested how the government responds to this, but it's not entirely government. We want to work out where the industry can play its role in the system as well. So, being more informed, having nice stable data sets so we can look forward really is and manage our system well. It's a key part of this theme. So this is more of a hygiene one, if you like, than a the broader notions that are contained in the first four of the themes, but
yeah.
Essential.
Yeah, absolutely essential. New Zealand had progress to do, and I think everybody would recognise the United States. Having worked in the US tourism industry for many years, the international tourism research that is available often isn't timely or comprehensive or frankly world-class. And so this is also an opportunity to reflect on the sort of research and data that's available in international tourism in the US as well. So that's a quick summary of those 5 themes. We tried to provide some sort of examples, but also make it relevant to you. Really, each and every one of these are universal, and each and every one are going to be required to ensure that we build back a more sustainable, productive, and successful tourism industry that is in balance with the natural environment and in balance with the wishes and aspirations and values of the community. So we want to actually get your input on this. We're going to run a quick poll now. So which of these areas do you think should be priorities in reimagining tourism in your area? So we're not talking about, New Zealand. We're talking about your destination, whether it might be a city, a state. You could reflect on the destination you head to in the United States, or if you're overseas, you might respond in terms of what's important for the specific destination that you're currently living and or doing business in. So we'll give you another few seconds to respond. You can actually indicate up to 3 of these. Okay, so why don't we wrap it up here in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's wrap up the polling and let's share the results. Okay, so Are they, hopefully they're visible, so we can see we've got pretty much a dead tie between the identity and purpose, being authentic and understanding the values, the stewardship one, protecting and enhancing your community and values, and then helping individuals, businesses and organizations recover and thrive. So many of the same themes that we've just emphasized. So Bruce, thinking about this, which of those 5 themes do you think, whether it's 1, 2, 3, are most important in terms of your perspective and in the future of tourism in New Zealand?
Yeah, it's quite a really tricky question because these things kind of go together in a lot of respects, particularly the first 4. But I think having a good understanding of the nature of you as your place as a destination, with the people in it and visitors coming, so you understanding the essence of the place and looking at protecting that and making sure it's reflecting who you are and providing something really unique for visitors. So it's kind of getting down to the essence of who you are and making sure that you're working consistently with that essence. So that's kind of the first one, but it does kind of flow through the other ones as well.
Yeah, very, very much so. So we're going to open it up for if there are any questions. So if you do have questions, you can submit those in the Q&A. Within Zoom, just to remind you about a couple of other resources before we get there. So I think we can... yours truly wrote a 2-part blog with my personal perspective on ways to reimagine the future of tourism, picking up on many of the things we've discussed today, but also some additional ideas. So that's accessible. That's one of the links up on this website right here, which includes the slide deck from today and links to those various entities and reports that we referenced, including the Tourism Task Force. Though, as Bruce mentioned, their draft report is not publicly available, but they have shared information about the process. And so you've got the web address where the report will be shared in the next few weeks, plus the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment and the Climate Change Commission, plus a link to TIA's own website and Tourism New Zealand's industry website if you want to understand a little bit more background and context about tourism in New Zealand. So let's move on to any questions from the audience.
All right, we have a couple questions for you guys. The first one is, what a beautiful country, which I have to agree with. What is the quarantine period right now in New Zealand?
Go ahead, Bruce.
I'll start and then you can finish, Chris. So it's 14 days for people coming in. There is a sort of a rationed capacity. It's about 5,000 a month, I think, able to come through or at any one time. So there's quite a system there to actually, get the space booked and get the flights, and a lot of it is focused on getting New Zealanders back home too. So that's quite a process there. So 14 days in quarantine is the basic requirement. I say that because Chris has come back from the States to New Zealand, has gone through the process.
Yes, I did that late last year, and it looks like I'll have to go back to the States in the coming few weeks, and then potentially come back again. It is focused initially, or for now, on New Zealand citizens and residents. So visitors cannot come to New Zealand, no matter how much you may want to. So New Zealand, along with a few other countries, took a very aggressive approach to tamping down. And so with a few little community outbreaks that, touch wood, we've been able to get on top of, there is no community transmission of COVID in New Zealand, and the border controls are a critical part of that. And so, frankly, that's going to be one of the big picture issues the tourism industry internationally is going to have to think through in terms of managing future risks. There's no doubt that those border controls are going to be a risk that the industry will have to understand and deal with, because wherever you are in the world, it's likely, in the face of another pandemic, countries may take a far more aggressive approach to closing borders. And that could happen literally within days. So, how you manage that risk, how you mitigate that risk, how you insure against that risk is going to be a critical part, I think, of reopening and recovering international tourism.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Bruce. And then another question for you, Bruce. How can other destinations around the world partner with the Tourism Industry Association of New Zealand?
Well, I think making contact is a good start. We do have a number of relationships with people in different parts of the world, and generally, and often people who are, to cite an example, Iceland has been interested in how New Zealand operates as an island destination. So a delegation from Iceland has come down and spent time in New Zealand and spent time with us, and just looking at how our systems work, and vice versa. We learned a lot from that experience on how Iceland is looking at their system. So, nice bilateral relationships like that are really, really good. We have close contacts with Australia. We're involved with the South Pacific Tourism Organisation. So we have conversations going on our tourism. It's being managed in the South Pacific. So, within the resources we've got, we really like to be helpful. A number of places from around the world have approached us on our sustainability program. And that's kind of a self-contained program that basically sets some specifications for what tourism businesses can do. So there's a lot of interest with a lot of overseas bodies with that particularly. So we try to be helpful, and so getting in touch with us is always the first start.
Gotcha, thank you. We have another question here from Helen Morano, who, if you missed it, she was our keynote presenter this morning. And you can view the recorded presentation later this week if you'd like to see her take on building back better from a global perspective. Helen is asking, how are the residents responding to this new inclusive approach?
My take on that is the residents haven't necessarily got there yet. I think we've been talking about stuff that's in the pipeline for implementation down the line. Certainly destination management planning is taking place. That is a really important thread. It is an interesting time for New Zealanders not having international visitors around, and so that's going to be a really intriguing part of the recovery, is when New Zealanders being able to go anywhere around the country and visit any time and get accommodation and all those sort of things quite freely. And when international tourism is working, it's that there's less of that freedom. So to the extent to which New Zealanders might get used to having their place back to themselves, that'll be an interesting part of the social conversation, I think, as we move through recovery. The Mood of the Nation survey, asks a question on how important do you think tourism is for New Zealand, and it gets really, really high ratings. I recall in the 90% plus range. So New Zealanders recognise tourism as an important part of who we are as a society and economy.
Thank you.
I think that the view of the locals is starts with how you reopen and recover tourism. So do they feel comfortable welcoming back visitors? So that's going to be a big issue here in New Zealand when we actually reopen borders. Do Kiwis feel comfortable with that? But it's also a big issue across the West. We've been doing research since March last year with Longwoods International on US American travellers' sentiment. And there's still a significant minority, something like 48%, that currently do not feel comfortable reopening their community to visitors. And so as America gets into a much better place, and Canada, every entity needs to ensure their locals feel comfortable with that reopening process. Otherwise, that social license is immediately put in sort of under pressure.
Yeah, and I think New Zealanders, a lot of people will be on guard for it. They'll be very cautious at the beginning to make sure that they're safe with visitation restarting.
Understandably. We do have a couple more questions, and we are running out of time, so we'll try and get through these as quickly as possible. Chris, can you clarify, did you say that there are 0 COVID cases in New Zealand right now?
Well, there's actually, we're dealing with a little outbreak right now, but New Zealand has only had 25 deaths. It's a country of 5 million. So we've been one of the more successful countries in terms of pursuing an eradication policy. And that's built around this aggressive approach to border controls and then tracking, tracing, etc. So yeah, I mean, outside of managing these little outbreaks, so there have been, in periods when we've had to, isolate, but for the most of the last year, New Zealanders have been out and about doing life as they normally would, including major sporting events with tens of thousands of people, etc. So, having come back from the States to New Zealand, it was a remarkable sort of transition to come back to normalcy. New Zealand
sounds nice.
Yeah, New Zealanders really treasure that, which, to Bruce's point, puts more pressure on the tourism industry to reopen in a responsible way.
Definitely. Final question. How do you think destinations can go about engaging consumers to be mindful of some of the issues that you outlined today to make good choices when selecting destinations and operators?
So I'll start and you might have a comment. So we mentioned travel responsibility codes. So whether it's the Tiaki Promise or New Zealand, in New Zealand, or your own iteration of that, or international resources like the Travel Care Code. So that is certainly one, educating visitors. There's a variety of certification programs around the world. We've been collaborating on some of that funding research with an entity called the Global Destination Sustainability Movement. Some of you might be familiar with that, which is arguably the most sort of holistic view at a destination's sustainability, not just in tourism, but more holistically in terms of water, for example, public transport, etc. So there's a range of resources you can tap into. What would you add, Bruce?
Yeah, the Tiaki Promise is an approach to educate visitors about, how to be great visitors in New Zealand. We're also really, through our sustainability program, wanting all tourism businesses to be acting sustainably. And our sort of theory on that is if all of our businesses are acting sustainably, our industry as a whole will be sustainable. So we're really working pretty hard at the granular level. So through that, our consumers can have an increasing confidence that they're dealing with good quality businesses, and their experience will be as sustainable as it can be.
Thank you. And thank you for all of you audience members who submitted questions. We are going to go ahead and wrap up as we've hit our time limit. Thank you very much, Chris and Bruce, for giving this presentation and definitely triggering some wanderlust to get down to New Zealand. And thank you to the audience for attending. If you are invited to join us for additional webinars throughout the rest of this week, if you would like to visit our Go West Summit Education Week page, you can register there. Thank you very much. I hope you all have a good rest of your day.